and I will be doing my presentation on child trafficking. So what is child trafficking? So child trafficking occurs when innocent children are manipulated into leaving their homes, used, and forced to work or be sold. These children are involved in sexual exploitation along with forced labor. Rapidly growing, this form of modern slavery is a violence against children's rights and can occur anywhere. Any child can be trafficked no matter their race, gender, upbringing, or education. According to the United States Department of Justice, child sex trafficking is the act of transporting a minor for the purpose of commercial sex act. Offenders of these crimes, who are commonly referred to as traffickers or pimps, target vulnerable children and gain control over them using a variety of manipulative methods. An example of this is making them think they can trust and rely on them or promising their families a better life. So what is the issue? So child trafficking is linked to the demand for cheap labor, especially where the working conditions are poor. Children may be forced into many dangerous and or illegal situations, including slavery, domestic labor, sexual exploitation or prostitution, or drug and or being turned into child soldiers. So the article, Child Modern Slavery, Trafficking and Health, a practical review of factors contributing to children's vulnerability and the potential impacts of severe exploitation on health, provides information on the health risks that children who are trafficked may be faced with. When children are taken, they are not provided with the necessary resources to be healthy for their personal growth. They do not have the nutrition they need, clean water, healthy air, clothes, shelter, or any protection. Children are also deprived of sleep, hygiene, toiletries, and so many more obligatory health resources, causing hunger, dehydration, and diseases. The children involved are just surviving and not living, enabling them to flourish. So now I will be going over some CRC articles that are related to the issue. So Article 3 says the best interests of children must be the primary concern in making decisions that may affect them. All adults should do what is best for children. When adults make decisions, they should think about how their decisions will affect children. This particularly applies to budget, policy, and lawmakers. So when children are trafficked, they are used for other benefits while suffering. So obviously, the children is not the primary concern. Article 4 says governments have a responsibility to take all available measures to make sure children's rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled, which their rights are obviously not taken into consideration when they are trafficked. Article 11 says governments should take steps to stop children being taken out of their own country illegally. The article is particularly concerned with parental abductions. The Convention's optional protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography has a provision that concerns abduction for financial aid. And this is basically what they are doing, kidnapping children. Article 16 says children have a right to privacy. The law should protect them from attacks against their way of life, their good name, their families, and their homes. So essentially, when a child is being trafficked, families are tricked into thinking they will have a better life when a lot of times they don't even get reunited and their kids are abused and suffering without their knowledge. Article 17 says children have the right to get information that is important to their health and well-being. Government should encourage mass media, radio, television, newspapers, and internet content sources to provide information that children can understand and to not promote materials that could harm children. Mass media should particularly be encouraged to supply information in languages that minority and indigenous children can understand. Children should also have access to children's books. So this goes back to health issues, what I was talking about before, and resources children need, not just to live, but to prosper in life. These children obviously are not being provided with books or any source of entertainment to make them happy. Article 19 says children have the right to be protected from being hurt and mistreated physically or mentally. So kids are abused and mistreated, and they are sometimes not even given shelter. Article 27 says children have the right to a standard of living that is good enough to meet their physical and mental needs. Government should help families and guardians who cannot afford to provide this, particularly with regard to food, clothing, and housing. That goes back to health. Article 32 says the government should protect children from work that is dangerous or might harm their health or their education when they are actually being forced into labor with horrible conditions and lacking any education. And then Article 4 says government should protect children from all forms of sexual exploitation and abuse. This provision in the convention is augmented by the optional protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. And that's exactly what child trafficking is. Article 35 says the government should take all measures possible to make sure that children are not abducted, sold, or trafficked. This provision in the convention is augmented by the optional protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution, and child pornography. Article 36, children should be protected from any activity that takes advantage of them or could harm their welfare and development. So now I will be going over 2 out of the 4 studies that was in my story map. So the first study is called Labor and Sex Trafficking Among Homeless Youth. So their goal was to get to the bottom of the nature of human trafficking among the youth and protect the anti-trafficking community with knowledge to fight the calamity. Researchers visited 13 cities in the United States and Canada to interview homeless young people. 911 young people aged 17 to 25 were interviewed on a voluntary basis. So what they found is nearly 1 in 5 of the 911 interviewed youth were victims of human trafficking, with 15% having been trafficked for sex, 7.4% trafficked for labor, and 3% trafficked for both. 21% of young women and 10% of young men interviewed had been trafficked for sex. 27% of LGBTQ youth reported experiences consistent with the U.S. federal definition of sex trafficking, and 32% of the youth interviewed had engaged in some ways in the sex trade at some point. 40% young females, 20% young men, and 56% of transgender youth. These are some charts for visual data. The next study was a bibliometric analysis using Scopus database. So their goal was to track down documents, sex trafficking documents online. So 2,044 documents were retrieved, 8 types, including research articles, reviews, notes, editorials, letters, short surveys, conference papers, and then the last 24 were unclassified. They then specifically focused on child trafficking and found that 199 of these documents were particularly for child trafficking. So, this next study mapped the roots and circumstances of victims and identified responses across the country using mixed methodology of documentary analysis, case file analysis, interviews with a sample of professionals and young people. And this study was important because they actually got to interview the young people. When it comes to child trafficking, often we don't hear the voices of the children and we hear voices of adults because we don't feel like children can speak up for themselves when we want to make them comfortable knowing that they can speak up. So, UNICEF is an organization that works to protect children from exploitation in countries around the world. They do this by providing a living wage for parents so that their children do not have to work to support the family and can attend school instead, lobbying governments and other partners to develop laws and strengthen child protection systems to prevent and respond to violence and abuse, advocating for the legal birth registration of all newborns, working with communities and faith-based organizations to change harmful societal norms that make children more vulnerable to exploitation, supporting the training of professionals working with children, including social workers, health workers, and police and border officials to help stop trafficking. I feel like the police and the government does not do enough to stop child trafficking and make it known to the communities. So some extra research, according to SaveTheChildren.org, children account for 27% of all human trafficking victims worldwide, and 2 out of every 3 child victims are girls. 168 million children are victims of forced labor. 215 million children are engaged in child labor, and 115 million of those children are involved in hazardous work. So, efforts towards improving conditions related to child trafficking. So, many efforts are taken into action when it comes to child trafficking, but I, again, don't believe the government has done enough to put a stop to it. I believe children should be our priority in this world, and protecting them is our number one job because they're our future and they're so vulnerable. Organizations are taking action by speaking up on the matter and studying the root causes of trafficking. The more efforts we put into making it aware, the closer we get to the bottom of the cause. Save the Children works with communities, local organizations, and the national government to prevent child trafficking and help the children who have been victims. They create awareness of the risks of migration and work with law enforcement to improve the protection of kids. They also are constantly launching advocacy campaigns, supporting public policy and training, and using research to create ways to guard children. So, how do children fight against the issue? So, again, we often hear about child trafficking from adults, but don't hear from the actual victims. Organizations are encouraging children to participate in interviews that allow them to share their experiences. Child trafficking, along with human trafficking, is something that occurs everywhere, even in areas that you would never think. And I believe in order to put a stop to trafficking, it comes down to bringing awareness to everyone around you. I think many people can be oblivious to the issue and don't realize how extreme it is. Before I did this research project, I didn't realize how extreme it was everywhere. And how it really is only getting worse. I would also hope that speaking on the issue could bring a child the education he/she needs to know if or when they are being trafficked. So then I just have some discussion questions for everyone. What do you believe our priority should be when bringing awareness to the issue of child trafficking? And what is the first step we would take? What are some signs a child may be trafficked without knowing so? Do you believe law enforcers are taking enough action when it comes to the issue? And if the answer is no, how can they improve their system? Okay, thank you so much for listening.